The daguerreotypist. It must not be supposed that life of personage, naturally so active as Phoebe, could be wholly confined within the precincts of the old Pynchon house. Clifford's demands upon her time were usually satisfied in those long days, considerably earlier than sunset. Quiet as his daily existence seemed, it nevertheless strained all the resources by which he lived. It was not physical exercise that overwearied him, for except that he sometimes wrought a little with a hoe, or paced the garden walk, or in rainy weather traversed a large unoccupied room, it was his tendency to remain only too quiescent as regarded any toil of the limbs and muscles, but either there was a smouldering fire within him that consumed his vital energy, or the monotony that would have dragged itself with benumbing effect over a mind differently situated was no monotony to Clifford. Possibly he was in a state of second growth and recovery, and was constantly assimilating nutriment for his spirit and intellect from sight, sound, and events, which passed as a perfect void to persons more practised with the world. As all his activity and vicissitude to the new mind of a child, so might it be likewise to a mind that had undergone a new kind of creation after its long suspended life. Be the cause what it might, Clifford commonly retired to rest, thoroughly exhausted, while the sunbeams were still melting through his window curtains, or were thrown with late lustre on the chamber wall. And while he thus slept early, as other children do, and dreamed of childhood, Phoebe was free to follow her own taste for the remainder of the day and evening. This was a freedom essential to the health even of a character so little susceptible to morbid influences of that of Phoebe. The old house, as we have already said, had both the dry rot and the damp rot in its walls, and was not a good breathe in other atmosphere than that. Hepzibah, though she had her valuable and redeeming traits, had grown to be a kind of lunatic by imprisoning herself so long in one place, with no other company than a single series of ideas, but one affectation, and one bitter sense of wrong. Clifford, the reader may perhaps imagine, was too inert to operate morally on his fellow creatures, however intimate and exclusive their relations with him. But the sympathy or magnetism among human beings is more subtle and universal than we think. It exists indeed among different classes of organized life, and vibrates from one to another. A flower, for instance, as Phoebe herself observed, always began to droop sooner in Clifford's hand, or Hepzibah's, than in her own, and by the same law, converting her whole daily life into a flower fragrance for those two sickly spirits, the blooming girl must inevitably droop and fade much sooner than if born on a younger and happier rest, unless she had now and then indulged in her brisk impulses and breathed rural air in a suburban walk, or ocean breezes along the shore, had occasionally obeyed the impulse of nature and New England girls by attending a metaphysical or philosophical lecture, or viewing a 7-mile panorama, or listening to a concert, had gone shopping about the city, ransacking entire depots of splendid merchandise, and bringing home a ribbon, had employed likewise a little time to read the Bible in her chamber, and had stolen a little more to think of her mother and her native place. Unless for such moral medicines as the above, we should soon have beheld our poor Phoebe grow thin, and put on a bleached, unwholesome aspect, and assume strange shy ways prophetic of old maidenhood and cheerless future. Even as it was, a change grew visible, a change partly to be regretted, although whatever charm it infringed upon was repaired by another, perhaps more precious. She was not so constantly gay, but had her moods of thought, which Clifford, on the whole, liked better than her former phase of unmingled cheerfulness, because now she understood him better and more delicately, sometimes even interpreted him to herself. Her eyes looked much larger and darker and deeper, so deep at silent moments they seemed like artesian wells, down into the infinite. She was less girlish than when we first beheld her alighting from the omnibus, less girlish but more a woman. The only youthful mind with which Phoebe had an opportunity of frequent intercourse was that of the daguerreotypist. Inevitably, by the pressure of seclusion about them, they had been brought into habits of some familiarity. Had they met under different circumstances, neither of these young persons would have been likely to bestow much thought upon the other, unless indeed their extremely dissimilarity should have proved a principle of mutual attraction. Both, it is true, were characters proper to New England life, possessing a common ground, therefore, in their more external development, but as unlike in their respective interiors as if their native crimes had been at world-wide distance. During the early part of their acquaintance, Phoebe had held back rather more than customary, than her frank and simple manners from Holgrave's not very marked advances, nor was she yet satisfied that she knew him well, although they most daily met and talked together in a kind, friendly, and what seemed to be a familiar way. The artist, in a desultory manner, had imparted to Phoebe something of his history. Young as he was, he had his career terminated at the point already attained. There had been enough incident to fill very credibly an autobiographic volume. A romance on the plane of Gil Blas, adapted to American society and manners, would cease to be a romance. The experience of many individuals among us who think it hardly worth the telling would equal the vicissitudes of the Spaniard's earlier life, while their ultimate success on the point whither they tend may be incomparably higher than that of any novelist might imagine for his hero. Halgrave, as he told Phoebe somewhat proudly, could not boast of his origin, unless as being exceedingly humble, nor of his education, except that it had been scantiest possible, and obtained by a few winter months' attendance at a district school. Left early to his own guidance, he had begun to self-dependent while yet a boy, and it was a condition aptly suited to his natural force of will, though now, being 22 years old, lacking some months, which are years in such a life, he had already been first a country school master, next a salesman in a country store, and either at the same time or afterwards the political editor of a country newspaper. He had subsequently traveled New England and Middle States as a peddler in the employment of a Connecticut manufacturing cologne water and other essences. In an episodical way, he had studied and practiced dentistry, with very flattering success, especially in many of the factory towns among our inland streams. As a supernumerary official of some kind or other aboard a packet ship, he had visited Europe and found means, before his return, to see Italy and part of France and Germany. At a later period, he had spent some months in a community of the florists. Still more recently, he had been a public lecturer on the mesmerism, for which science, as he assured Phoebe, and indeed satisfactorily proved by putting Chanticleer, who happened to be scratching nearby, to sleep, he had very remarkable endowments. His present phase as a daguerreotypist was of no more importance in his own view, nor likely to be more permanent than any of the preceding ones. It had been taken up with the careless alacrity of an adventurer who had his bread to earn. It would be thrown aside as carelessly whenever he should choose to earn his bread by some other equally digressive means. But what was most remarkable, and perhaps showed more common poise in the young man, was the fact, amid all these personal vicissitudes, he had never lost his identity. Homelessness, as he had been constantly changing his whereabouts, and therefore responsible neither to public opinion nor to individuals, putting off one exterior and scratching up another, to be soon shifted for a third. He had never violated the innermost man, but had carried his conscience along with him. It was impossible to know Halgrave without recognizing this to be the fact. Hepzibah had seen it. Phoebe soon saw it likewise, and gave him the sort of confidence which such a certainty inspires. She was startled, however, and sometimes repelled, not by any doubt of his integrity to whatever law he acknowledged, but by a sense that his law differed from her own. He made her uneasy, and seemed to unsettle everything around her by his lack of reverence for what was fixed, unless at a moment's warning it could be established at its right to hold his ground. Then, moreover, she scarcely thought him affectionate in his nature. He was too calm and cool an observer. Phoebe felt his eye often, his heart seldom or never. He took a certain kind of interest in Hepzibah and her brother, and Phoebe herself. He studied them attentively, and allowed no slightest circumstance of their individualities to escape him. He was ready to do them whatever good he might, but after all, he never exactly made common cause with them, nor gave any reliable evidence that he loved them better in proportion as he knew them more. In his relations with them, he seemed to be in quest of mental food, not heart sustenance. Phoebe could not conceive what interested him so much in her friends and herself intellectually, since he cared nothing for them, or comparatively so little as objects of human affection. Always in his interviews with Phoebe, the artist made especial inquiry as to the welfare of Clifford, whom, except at the Sunday festival, he seldom saw. "Does he still seem happy?" he asked one day. "As happy as a child," answered Phoebe, "but like a child, too, very easily disturbed." "How disturbed?" inquired Halgrave. "By things without, or thoughts within?" "I cannot see his thoughts. How should I?" replied Phoebe, with simple piquancy. "Very often his humor changes without any reason that can be guessed at, just as cloud comes over the sun. Latterly, since I have begun to know him better, I feel it to be not quite right to look closely into his moods. He has such a great sorrow that his heart is made all solemn and sacred by it. When he is cheerful, when the sun shines into his mind, then I venture to peep in just as far as the light reaches, but no further. It is holy ground where the shadow falls." "How prettily you express this sentiment," said the artist. "I can understand the feeling without possessing it. Had I your opportunities, no scruples would prevent me from fathoming Clifford to the full depth of my plummet line." "How strange that you should wish it," remarked Phoebe, involuntarily. "What is Covington Clifford to you?" "Oh, nothing, of course, nothing," answered Halgrave with a smile. Only this is such an odd and incomprehensible world. The more I look at it, the more it puzzles me, and I begin to suspect that a man's bewilderment is the measure of his wisdom. Men and women, and children too, are such strange creatures that one never can be certain what he really knows them, nor even guess what they have been, from what he sees them to be now. Judge Pynchon, Clifford, what a complex riddle, a complexity of complexities, do they present. It requires intuitive sympathy like a young girl's to solve it. A mere observer like myself, who never have any intuitions and am at best only subtle and acute, is pretty certain to go astray. The artist now turned the conversation to themes less dark than which they touched upon. Phoebe and he were young together, nor had Hallgrave in his premature experience of life wasted entirely that beautiful spirit of youth, which gushing forth from one small heart and fancy may diffuse itself over the universe, making it all as bright as on the first day of creation. Man's own youth is the world's youth. At least he feels as if it were, and imagines that the earth's granite substance is something not yet hardened, which he can mold into whatever shape he likes. So it was with Hallgrave. He could talk sagely about the world's old age, but never actually believe in what he said. He was a young man still, and therefore looked upon the world, that grey-bearded and wrinkled profligate, decrepit without being venerable, as a tender stripling, capable of being improved into all that it ought to be, but scarcely had yet to show the remotest promise of becoming. He had that sense of inward prophecy which a young man had better die at once than not to have, and a mature man had better not have them been born than utterly to relinquish, that we are not doomed to creep on forever in the old bad way, but that is this very now. There are the harbingers abroad of a golden era to be accomplished in his own lifetime. It seemed to Hallgrave, as doubtless it has seemed to the hopeful of every century since the epoch of Adam's grandchildren, that in this age, more than ever before, the moss-grown and rotten past is to be torn down, and lifeless institutions to be thrust out of the way, and their dead corpses buried, and everything to begin anew. As to the main point, may we never live to doubt it. As to better centuries that are coming, the artist was surely right. His error lay in supposing that his age, more than any past or future one, is destined to see the tattered garments of antiquity exchanged for a new suit instead of gradually renewing themselves by patchwork, and applying his own little life-spawn as a measure of an interminable achievement, and more than all in fancying that it mattered anything to the great end in view, whether he himself should contend for it or against it. Yet it was well for him to think so, this enthusiasm infusing itself through the calmness of his character, and thus taking an aspect of settled thought and wisdom, would serve to keep his youth pure and make his aspirations high, and when with the years settling down more weightily upon him, his early faith should be modified by inevitable experience, it would be with no harsh and sudden revolution of his sentiments. He would still have faith in a man's brightening destiny, and perhaps love him all the better as he should recognize his helplessness on his own behalf, and the haughty faith with which he began life would be well bartered for a far humbler one at its close, in discerning that man's best directed effort accomplishes a kind of dream, while God is the sole worker of realities. Hallgrave had read very little, and in that little in passing through the thoroughfare of his life, with the mystic language of his books, was necessarily mixed up with the babble of the multitude, so that both one and the other were apt to lose any sense that might have been properly their own. He considered himself a figure, and was certainly a thoughtful turn, but with his own path to discover, and perhaps hardly yet reached the point where an educated man begins to think the true value of his character lay in that deep consciousness of inward strength, which made all his past vicissitudes seem merely like the change of garments, and that enthusiasm so quiet that he scarcely knew of its existence, but which gave warmth to everything that he laid his hand on, and that personal ambition hidden from his own will as the other eyes among his more generous impulses, but in which lurked a certain efficacy that might solidify him from a theorist into the champion of some practical cause. Altogether in his culture and want of culture, in his crude, wild, and misty philosophy, and the practical experience that contracted into some of its tendency, in his magnanimous zeal for a man's welfare, in his recklessness of whatever the ages had established in a man's behalf, and his faith in his infidelity, in what he had and what he lacked, the artist might fitly enough stand forth as a representative of many compeers of his native land. His career it would be difficult to prefigure. There appeared to be qualities in Hallgrave, such as, in a country where everything is free to the hand that can grasp it, could hardly fail to put some of the world's prizes within his reach. But these matters are delightfully uncertain. At almost every step in life, we meet with young men of just about Hallgrave's age, for whom we anticipate wonderful things, but of whom, even after much and careful inquiry, we never happen to hear any other word. The effervescence of youth and passion, and the fresh gloss of the intellect and imagination, endow them with a false brilliancy, which makes fools of themselves and other people. Like certain chintzes, calicos, and ginghams, they show finely in their first newness, but cannot stand the sun and rain, and assume a very sombre aspect after washing day. But our business is with Hallgrave, as we find him on this particular afternoon in the arbour of the Pinchin garden. In that point of view, it was pleasant sight to behold this young man, with so much faith in himself, so fair an appearance of admirable powers, so little harmed too by the many tests that had tried his mettle. It was pleasant to see him in his kindly intercourse with Phoebe. Her thought had scarcely done him justice with pronounced him cold, or if so, he had grown warmer now. Without such purpose on her part, and unconsciously on his, she made the house of the Seven Gables like a home to him, the garden of a familiar precinct, with the inside of which he prided himself. He fancied that he could look through Phoebe on all around her, and could read her like a page of a child's story-book. But those transparent natures, often deceptive in their depth, those pebbles at the bottom of the fountain, are farther from us than we think. Thus the artist, whatever he might judge of Phoebe's capacity, was beguiled by some silent charm of hers to talk freely of what he dreamed of doing in the world. He poured himself out as to another self. Very possibly he forgot Phoebe while he talked to her, and was removed only by the inevitable tendency of thought, when rendered sympathetic by enthusiasm and emotion, to flow into the first safe reservoir which it finds. But had you peeped at them through the chinks of the garden fence, the young man's earnestness and heightened colour might have led you to suppose that he was making love to the young girl. At length something was said by Hallgrave that made it opposite for Phoebe to inquire what had first brought him acquainted with her cousin Hepzibah, and why he now chose to lodge in the desolate old Pinchin house. Without directly answering her, he turned from the future, which had hitherto been the theme of his discourse, and began to speak of the influences of the past. One subject indeed is but the reverberation of the other. Shall we never get rid of the past? Cried he, keeping up the earnest tone of his preceding conversation. If it lies upon the present like a giant's dead body, in fact, the case is just as if a young giant were compelled to waste all his strength in carrying about the corpse of the old giant, his grandfather, who died a long while ago, and only needs to be decently buried. Just think a moment, and it will startle you to see what slaves are by gone times to death, if we give the matter the right word. But I do not see it, observed Phoebe. For example, then, continued Hallgrave, a dead man, if he happen to make a will, disposes of wealth no longer his own, or if he die intestate, it is distributed in accordance with the notions of men no longer dead than he. Much longer dead than he. A dead man sits on all our judgment seats, and living judges do but search out and repeat his decisions. We read in dead men's books, we laugh at dead men's jokes, we cry at dead men's pathos, we are sick of dead men's diseases, physical and moral, and die of the same remedies with which dead doctors kill their patients. We worship the living deity according to dead men's forms and creeds. Whatever we seek to do of our own free motion, a dead man's icy hand obstructs us, turns our eyes to what point we may. A dead man's white, imitable face encounters them and freezes our very heart, and we must be dead ourselves before we can begin to have our proper influence on our own world, which we will then be no longer in our world, but the world of another generation, which we shall have no shadow of a right to interfere. And I ought to have said, too, that we live in dead men's houses, for instance, in this of the Seven Gables. And why not, said Phoebe, for so long as we can be comfortable in them. But we shall live to see the day, I trust, went on the artist, when no man shall build this house for posterity. Why should he? He might just as reasonably order a durable suit of clothes, leather or gutta percha, or whatever else lasts longest, so that his great-grandchildren should have the benefit of them, cut precisely the same figure in the world that he himself does. If each generation were allowed and expended to build its own houses, that single change, comparatively unimportant to in itself, would imply almost every reform which society is now suffering for. I doubt whether even our public edifices, our capitals, state houses, courthouses, city halls, and churches ought to be built of such permanent materials as stone and brick. It were better that they should crumble to ruin once in 20 years, or thereabouts, as a hint to the people to examine into and reform the institutions which they symbolize. How you hate everything old, said Phoebe in dismay. It makes me dizzy to think of such a shifting world. I certainly love nothing mouldy, answered Hallgrave. Now in this old Pinchin house, it is a wholesome place to live in, with its black shingles, and the green moss that shows how damp they are, its dark, low-studded rooms, its grime and sordidness, which are the crystallization on the walls of the human breath that has been drawn and exhaled here in discontent and anguish. The house ought to be purified with fire, purified till only its ashes remain. Then why do you live in it? Asked Phoebe, a little piqued. I am pursuing my studies here, not in books, however, replied Hallgrave. The house, in my view, is expressive of that odious and abominable past with all its bad influences against which I have just been declaiming. I dwell in it for a while, that I may know the better how to hate it. By the by, did you ever hear the story of Moll the wizard, and what happened between him and your immeasurably great-grandfather? Yes, indeed, said Phoebe. I heard it long ago from my father, and 2 or 3 times from my cousin Hepzibah in the month I have been here. She seems to think that all the calamities of the pensions began from that quarrel with the wizard, as you call him, and you, Mr. Hallgrave, look as if you thought so too. How singular that you should believe what is so very absurd, when you reject so many things that are a great deal worthier of credit. I do believe it, said the artist seriously, not as a superstition, however, but as approved by unquestionable facts, and as exemplifying a theory. Now see, under those 7 gables, at which we now look up, and which old Colonel Pyncheon meant to be the house of his descendants in prosperity and happiness down to an epoch far beyond the present, under that roof, through a portion of 3 centuries, there has been a perpetual remorse of conscience, a constantly defeated hope, strife against kindred, various misery, a strange form of death, dark suspicion, unspeakable disgrace, all or most of which calamity I have the means of tracing to old Puritan's inordinate desire to plant and endow a family. To plant a family, this idea is at the bottom of the most wrong and mischief which men do. The truth is that once in every half-century at longest, a family should be merged into the great obscure mass of humanity and forget all about its ancestors. Human blood, in order to keep its freshness, should run in hidden streams, as the water of an aqueduct is conveyed in subterranean pipes. In the family existence of these Pyncheons, for instance, forgive me, Phoebe, but I cannot think of you as one of them. In their brief New England pedigree, there has been time enough to infect them all with one kind of lunacy or another. You speak very unceremoniously of my kindred, said Phoebe, debating with herself whether she ought to take offence. I speak true thoughts to a true mind, answered Hallgrave, with a vehemence which Phoebe had not before witnessed in him. The truth is, as I say, furthermore, the original perpetrator and the father of this mischief appears to have perpetuated himself, and still walks the street, at least this very image in mind and body, with the fairest prospect of transmitting to posterity as rich and wretched an inheritance as he has received. Do you remember the daguerreotype and its resemblance to the old portrait? How strangely in earnest you are, exclaimed Phoebe, looking at him with surprise and perplexity, half alarmed and partly inclined to laugh. You talk of the lunacy of the Pyncheons. Is it contagious? I understand you, said the artist, colouring and laughing. I believe I am a little mad. The subject has taken hold of my mind with the strangest tenacity of clutch. Since I have lodged in yonder old gable, as one method of throwing it off, I have put an incident of the Pyncheon family history, with which I happen to be acquainted, into the form of a legend, and mean to publish it in a magazine. Do you write for the magazines? Inquired Phoebe. It is possible you did not know it, cried Hallgrave. Well, such is literary fame. Yes, Miss Phoebe Pyncheon. Among the multitude of my marvellous gifts, I have that of writing stories, and my name is figured, I can assure you, on the covers of Graham and Godey, making as respectable an appearance, for aught I could see, as any of the canonized bead roll with which it was associated. In the humorous line, I am thought to have a very pretty way with me, and as for pathos, I am as provocative of tears as an onion. But shall I read you my story? Yes, it is not very long, said Phoebe, and added laughingly, nor very dull. At this latter point was one which the daguerreotypist could not decide for himself. He forthwith produced his roll of manuscript, and while the late sunbeams gilded the 7 gables, he began to read.